and there's no medical explanation at all for why the person's arm is paralyzed, but it's still paralyzed. It's still like they physically cannot move their arm. And that's when that happens, it's called conversion disorder. And that's actually a mental disorder. And so it's actually, in some sense caused by the brain. And so it's not a physical thing. I mean, it's an example of how thoughts in the brain cause physical ailments, but it's not like a medical thing, if that makes sense. Like there's nothing physically disconnected. It's a thought mental kind of thing.
Welcome back to the Out of the Box podcast. This is Steele and I, Jose, your host today here with you. And today we're going to be talking about a particular topic, which is how our thoughts can affect our brain. But before we actually get started, we just want to invite you to subscribe to our channel. This is a channel dedicated to bringing up about truth in our world, going through different ideas, different questions, and analyzing the truth behind it and what we can do with the information. We try to process different things logically and try to see it from different angles. So if that sounds like something that you would like to join us in this journey with, please subscribe to our channel. But without further ado, we're going to be talking about how our thoughts change our brain. So Steele, what do you think about that? I know we had previously talked a little bit about this topic. So what are some initial thoughts?
Yeah, so let me start off by a fascinating discovery that I made recently. I've been reading this book through my work called Switch on Your Brain by Dr. Caroline Leaf, and she is a cognitive neuroscientist. And so she was talking about how in the book Switch on Your Brain, how like thoughts are more physical than we realize. Like thoughts are kind of like physical neurons and synapses in our brain. Like they literally are real physical things, microscopic, of course, but they're there. And so memories, thoughts, just all the different things, the associations in our brain that we've talked about, like the associations when someone's punished or rewarded, they can be thought of as physical neurons and synapses in our brain. And she was talking about how through our willpower, we have the ability to change our thoughts. Like that's what new research is showing. Because I remember from my psychological studies that scientists used to believe that the brain was stuck. It was not flexible. It would stay the same for the rest of your life. But new research and new studies are showing that actually the brain is plastic. It's neuroplastic. It has neuroplasticity with the neurons. So that means the neurons and synapses can change. It doesn't matter how old you are or not, they can always change. Even people who suffer brain damage and certain levels of brain trauma can also still change their brain with techniques, practice, and all that good stuff, therapy, and all that. So she made an interesting kind of idea that had me thinking. She was posing the question in the workbook about whether free will, about what if our thoughts, if we think about it in the sense that our consciousness, our mind can control our brain instead of the other way of thinking about it, that our brain controls us. If we think our mind and consciousness can control our brain and can physically change our thoughts and our synapses, what does that mean about free will? And so to that, I kind of just open that up to you and kind of just throw that your way and your thoughts about it. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it shows how our free will can either help us to continue live or can eventually kill us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So self-destruct us, right? Um, that if we do choose for our thoughts to control our being, then we can choose to punish ourselves. Sometimes we think like, well, the only person that it affects is me, right?
Hmm.
When in reality, it could potentially be affecting more than just me.
Yeah. It's so cool. She talked about that too, how the way you're talking about, like if we have negative thoughts, we think, like you said, maybe it only affects us, but in reality, doesn't it affect other people? Because our thoughts make us feel and act a certain way, and then we project that into the world, and other people around us pick up on that, and then it affects their thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. So I think, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we don't live in a vacuum, or if we live as hermits, well, maybe that potentially could be the truth. But you know the fact that we live in a society, and we choose to live in a society, then that means that we're, even though we think that we are doing things by ourselves, we are interconnected, and so the things we do affect the community.
Definitely, I think so too.
Maybe not in a grand scheme, right? But let's say you throw something, a piece of trash in the street. Well, maybe the first piece of trash might not affect anyone, but after, if you keep doing it for a couple of weeks or years, then they see all the trash that you've been throwing away, and it makes the community look bad. It looks kind of trashed up. So, and if people start kind of picking on that behavior, and everybody starts doing that, then you have a bunch of trash everywhere. And that's just, to put an example of simple idea of trash, meaning could potentially mean a thought, an idea in the culture, um, things that deteriorate the society.
Right. Yeah, and you can see how that can spread in a school or an organization or even just small cities. And the environment can be changed by a few people with what they project out into the world. And chain reactions can result. I mean, elections and leaders and everything, like, there's chain reactions there that are taking place. And like, it's just the belief systems, everything. It comes from one person or a few people and then grows like a seed into a tree and then branches out into society. And that comes from
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it was an interesting topic about what you're saying about thoughts affecting the human being, right?
Yeah, they do. Emotions, behaviors.
Yeah, because I'm sure certain thoughts, just the same way that certain thoughts can trigger stress at in moments when you're not even experiencing that moment again, but the fact that you can rethink through that moment, you can your body becomes immersed in that memory, right? And so it's almost like you're reliving that experience.
Yeah, definitely. Thoughts definitely have effects on people. And I've seen it work in my work. I've definitely seen it. I mean, thoughts of trauma affect people. They literally affect people's behaviors, their avoidance or distress, the physical sensations of stress, panic attacks, all of it. I mean, thoughts can drive people to have a worse panic attack than not. If you hyper focus and start thinking that you're having a heart attack or going crazy or losing control during a panic attack, or start hyper focusing on all of the physical sensations of a panic attack, and then you start having thoughts of anticipating another one, those very thoughts are what drive the panic attack in the first place. Now, not always, sometimes there's other things in place, but I mean, I've been able to work with clients to change thoughts in order for them to gain better control over their panic attacks. And a lot of it has to do with learning how to not have the anticipatory anxiety for another panic attack, which comes from thoughts. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, we call them automatic thoughts. It can be called irrational thoughts because those are thoughts that are inflexible. They're unhealthy. They're causing distress. They're negative thoughts. They're oriented towards only one side, negative. And what we try to do in therapy is to teach them that there is a middle and there's a positive, there's a neutral, and there's a negative. And what you're doing is you're choosing to focus on the negative when there's all these other ways of thinking about this situation or this thought or this belief or whatever it is that's causing them distress. And then once they realize that, they can make their thinking flexible. And then according to, Dr. Caroline Leaf, they're physically changing their synapses and neurons in their brain whenever they practice changing their thoughts, like to healthier thoughts. And so it's not just we think of thoughts as these metaphorical, non-material things, but in reality, it seems as if they are more physical than we realize. So it seems like that's what's happening, when you change your mind about something or way you think about it.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting how it almost seems like thoughts are the programming of a computer, right? Like thoughts are the language and the code that the computer is running, right? That's the thoughts. And if there's a bad code or a negative thought, it makes the computer malfunction or the human being malfunction. What does malfunction mean? It means that it's not working at its peak efficiency
Mm,
or at its natural state of being and what it could be. So
right.
it's interesting, yeah, that the the thoughts are having a physiological effect on the body,
Yeah.
which is triggering either stress chemicals or you know different hormones to react in a certain way.
Mm,
And after a long period of time it becomes almost like part of you, but it could potentially be that it's not even not natural for that to be there, or that it's become a norm, but it's in reality, right? The
right.
truth is that that's not how it should be, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes we're like, well, that's how it's been forever, right? Like that's how I've been. Sometimes people can justify a thought, right? Justify their thought, almost protecting their thought from being taken away or changed, because that's all they known. That's all they
Yeah.
know to think
They,
about
they
a
don't.
certain idea.
Yeah, the inflexible thinking, yeah, their thinking is not flexible because they're not looking at other ways to think about whatever it is that they're thinking about. And what you said was interesting, how the stress hormone, the stress, can be physical stress can be caused by thoughts because it's definitely true. I mean, like let's think about like this, break it down to so where does the stress response come from? It's the flight or fight response. Flight, you run away from the danger. Fight, you prepare to fight the danger. Well, that's from evolutionary, just history of human beings existing on this planet and being faced by various threats in the environment. And what happens when we see a threat? Let's take an example. Like, let's say you see a snake in the environment. Well, we just see that as a threat. Like most of us automatically perceive a snake in the environment as a threat, a danger to our life. And that's how our brain perceives it. That's why we get the stress response because anything that we perceive, and I say perceive because we can choose to perceive it as a threat or not. Some people might perceive it as a threat and some people might not. And so if we perceive the snake as a threat in the environment, we get the stress response. And that happens with perception, thoughts. Our thoughts choose how we want to perceive it as a danger or not, triggers those stress hormones. Cortisol runs down all the way to the adrenal glands on the kidney, releases testosterone, adrenaline, all these, or adrenaline, I should say, and all these different chemicals that trigger all the physical symptoms of the flight or fight, which is beating heart, fast breathing, slow digestion, everything that prepares you to run or fight. And so it's fascinating because then when that happens with chronic stress for years, then the immune system actually starts to decrease. So it does thoughts in that sense, if you tie it all the way back to the beginning, the way we perceive a threat in the environment, whether it's financial stress, financial problems, breakup, a divorce, all the other psychological horrors of life, losing a loved one, and we perceive that as a threat because threats aren't just snakes, but they're also generalized to other things like tests and bills and everyday things we face every day. And so if our thoughts perceive it as a threat, the stress response, and it affects us physically. So yes, I do think that's right. What you were saying
Yeah.
about, yeah,
Yeah, you can see the chain reaction of how thoughts eventually lead up over years to a certain sickness or a certain path. And that's what I think is so interesting, because nowadays we have diseases that are being diagnosed that don't have a cure.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's actually not if that's actually because the real problem is not something physical, but rather mental, right? So it's the mental hardware or running software that we have running through our mind with our thoughts is generating a certain illness in the body that
Yeah.
doctors are trying to figure out, well, why is this happening? It's not like, you know, certain cells just started doing this because they just wanted to, or
Computer
it
virus.
yeah, it's a computer virus or an auto-generated illness.
It's like a thought virus, and then maybe it's just sparked by one thought. Sometimes it's just one, and then it just triggers a cascade chain reaction of other negative thoughts. And what you're saying
Yeah,
is so true, man. Like, if you ever heard of conversion disorder, that's a legitimate diagnosis in the DSM-5. And conversion disorder is kind of what you're describing. An example of it would be like if someone's arm is paralyzed and they can't think of any medical explanation for it. The doctors run all these tests, and there's no medical explanation at all for why the person's arm is paralyzed, but it's still paralyzed. It's still like they physically cannot move their arm. And that's when that happens, it's called conversion disorder. And that's actually a mental disorder. And so it's actually, in some sense caused by the brain. And so it's not a physical thing. I mean, it's an example of how thoughts in the brain cause physical ailments, but it's not like a medical thing, if that makes sense. Like there's nothing physically disconnected. It's a thought mental kind of thing. And that can cause people to also go blind. It's been known to cause other things like chronic pain. And they diagnose conversion disorder because they can't think of any medical reason for it. Same thing with like stomach pain with anxiety. Anxiety can cause nausea. So there, yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, and it's like sometimes not even thoughts that you have, but external aspects that in a way affect you, right? For example, like during the pandemic, a lot of people were scared. A lot of people um, feared, the fact of getting COVID. And so that fear triggers stress hormones, which therefore then, triggers the immune system to weaken, which you become more susceptible to things like COVID. And so you eventually end up getting COVID or another illness. I don't know. But it was due to the fear of getting it, which almost made you more susceptible to actually getting it.
yeah, it weakens the immune system, and they've tied stress to an increased risk of just being sick. There's been I've heard of things tying those two things together. So I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah,
Yeah, it's crazy. Is
yeah.
there any other thoughts that the book kind of revealed about how thoughts connect to a physical change in the body?
The other than that, really, well, there's a mention of epigenetics, which we've touched on before in prior podcasts. The idea that thoughts and beliefs can possibly turn. That's what she was talking about in the book too. That thoughts and beliefs can potentially. That research seems to be showing that they can actually turn genes on and off with thoughts, and strong thoughts, strong beliefs, I guess over a certain period of time can just make a gene express itself or not express itself. And so that means you're affecting proteins and just all the chain reaction of things that come from that, which leads to physical changes in the body. And so that's what it's kind of what epigenetics is that idea. So
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, a lot of things that say in the Bible are just like she was pointing out in the book too, and how we've talked about before. It seems like the Bible is just ahead of its time, ahead of science, because it was saying these things before science discovered it.
yeah, about belief, about
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, in how it mentions, we have a whole pocket podcast that we've talked about this before too, but how it said like when you believe with your heart and with your mind fully, you know, your faith can move mountains, right? And which is crazy because our thoughts can really change our physical body. But does it provide any examples on how you can use it for good? Like, I'm sure I mean, we've talked about how it can do it for bad, and how it can
Oh yeah.
create illness and stuff like that. But what is the other side of the coin?
Yeah, and I've only read probably like I think I've only read the first chapter or introduction. I'm sure it's going to get deeper into it, but I do, as I understand, I mean, it's the good that it can do is it can get you out of the negative cycle of thoughts that are contributing to those problems. And so to do that, there's different ways, but of course, cognitive behavioral therapy, that's what I'm going to jump to is because that's the way I think about it is, cognitive, the thinking part of it, the behavior, and then there's also emotions in there. So all of those affect each other. Emotions affect thoughts affect emotions, and they affect each other like either which way. And both of those affect behaviors. So if you can change your thoughts from negative to positive or even more realistic, it doesn't even necessarily have to be like positive in a delusional way, but like realistic, just looking at it in a different way than negative. And so if you can do that, then you can change how you perceive the world. Maybe you're perceiving it negatively before, but now you can choose to reframe it into a more positive way. And in that sense, you can bring about positive change in your life because that's going to lead to positive behaviors. And that can be applied to so many different things. I mean, just examples like if you need to exercise more or diet more, or if you're having a relationship conflict, or just different things like that, trying to process something horrific that you've gone through. So it can bring about mental positive changes. I can say that, you know, as far as physical, it can help you overcome a panic attack and other mental things. Like I'm sure some therapies can help people overcome conversion disorder. So, but like physical things, that's something that I haven't really, gotten too deep into,
Yeah,
that's,
because I mean, I've even heard of well, I know I've talked about him before, Joe Dispenza, Dr. Joe Dispenza. He
uh,
was a neurologist, but after being able to heal himself through thought alone, of his spinal cord coming back into place, which was something that he knew was only able to be fixed by surgery, but him knowing that he didn't want to go through surgery because of all the after effects that he was going to have to deal through with that surgery. I mean, he found the power of what our mind is capable of. So
yeah,
if it's capable of naturally healing itself, right? It's almost like the science of medicine is already within us,
yeah, exactly.
right? And that's our thoughts.
As I'm sure Jesus said probably at some point in the New Testament, I feel like, something to that degree, like it could change everything. I mean, if we really find more research on this stuff, I'm going to finish reading that book, of course, and find out more. But yeah, I mean, think about how much that could really change. I mean, that seriously, like if we could actually think about it, if we could actually get really good at harnessing our thoughts and turn on and off genes at will with our thoughts, I mean, that has so many possibilities with healing and stuff. And
But do you think this supernatural ability is something that people think like, oh, this is just a fad? It's
oh yeah,
just because
I'm
when
sure.
you hear of that, it challenges your state of reality.
I'm
You're
sure.
like, well, is it possible? Is it really possible?
I'm sure a lot of people are skeptical, and I just encourage them to check out that book, Switch on Your Brain, because I mean she's a cognitive neuroscientist, and neuroscience is not the easiest field to study. I mean, I'm not saying you just trust any scientist, but like just always look for yourself and try to figure it out for yourself, But she's kind of saying how a lot of research seems to be pointing in that direction. And of course, I want to check out that research myself because I always like to investigate things, But what I wonder is what you think about what that means about free will. Like, do you think, like, what is controlling our thoughts? What is changing our thoughts? Is it the brain that's just this physical thing that's for whatever reason, right? And it's not free will, it's just neurons happening to fall into the right place? Or is it free will that's controlling our thoughts? And then we have that free will, and we can use that free will to change us physically and all that stuff, like we talked about. You know what I mean? Like,
I think that with thoughts, there's such a thing of enslavement. We are enslaved sometimes to our own thoughts, which don't allow us to act freely.
mm,
We think we might think that the decision that we're making is out of free will, which is perhaps an illusion.
yeah,
I've heard that before, like
yeah,
perhaps
it's a
like I think it's the Matrix where it says like, the decision is just an illusion.
yeah. If all of our choices can be summarized with binary yes and no, then technically, how much we're limited on how much control we have. We think we made a decision when in reality we just chose one out of two options that were predetermined on certain predetermined paths. And yet, we also, that's one way to look at it. And yet also we know, if we believe in the other sense of God giving us free will, but then the problem of God also seeing the future, it's hard to understand how God can see the future and we also have free will. But if there's multiple choices with multiple paths that God can see in front of us, then we can still make the choice to choose which path to go on. And does that still give us free will? Or is it just the illusion of free will because there's still limited choices? And in that sense, it's still predetermined. So you can see how it can become quickly complicated when you start trying to pick it apart. It starts to kind of get kind of confusing. Um, that's why free will is a very difficult topic, and I still don't fully understand it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I mean, and free will is I think it's more of a matter of, because I think there's the idea, if we break down the word, it's free will, right?
willpower.
So it's willpower, and I guess if we break down the definition, it's like the ability to make a decision that you truly want to make
Yeah, freely. Yeah.
freely. Yeah, but I feel like the idea that freely we can choose a decision, sometimes we're not free to make a decision,
Yeah, we were
right?
saying earlier.
There's like what we were saying, that you know of course, like there's for example, I know we've talked about drug addictions. Well, a
Yeah,
drug addict can't make a free will decision sometimes, because the addiction has driven them to just go into one path, so they can't really choose to be responsible of something, right? Because they're inhibited by by this addiction to reach a commitment, or you know a responsibility.
and I would even challenge it and say maybe it's not that they can't control it, but it's extremely extraordinarily difficult to make a different choice. It's not that they
Yeah,
and there maybe there's some tiny, like the tiniest level of choice there, like of control, but it's so small that, and that brain pathway we talked about, you mentioned from that book, that it's like a road made in the brain, and the more you travel that road in the brain, the easier it is to fall into that choice. So if the drug has taken control of their brain, metaphorically, then the road most traveled by using the drug is going to be the easiest path choice to make. And when you add withdrawal, cravings, and all that other symptoms in there, yeah, it becomes extremely difficult to not choose to use the substance. And
mm,
so, what you were saying made me think, tying into what you're talking about. Maybe it's the case, like you said, that sometimes we don't have free will because our thoughts are so powerful. Especially thinking about mental disorders and mental illness, our thoughts are so powerful that we cannot think any other way at that moment in our life. So maybe you could make the case that free will doesn't always we don't always have free will over our thoughts, but sometimes we do, So it's not like it's not that we never have free will, but it's like that we sometimes we don't and sometimes we do. I wonder if that's maybe another way of
And I think sometimes it's also the discipline aspect, right? When we become disciplined, all the things that people say are really hard to do is actually what frees you from actually being able to make a decision.
yeah, because we can put
Or perhaps, being disciplined allows you to choose the greatest good at all times,
yeah, so
right?
you reframed it. You reframed that thought.
But for example, let's say, but in that case, if you had to go through this process of disciplining, then you have programmed yourself to make, unless that's your goal, right? Unless that's your goal, right? That you want to, let's say, for example, become more virtuous or grow in virtue and be healthier, right? Eat healthier foods or exercise, um, have good relationships with people. We all know that those are ideals and that humans, almost every human strives for, right? And that's where people can flourish the best, right? So if it is a goal, it's only through discipline that people can achieve it, because you have to be consistent for a long period of time, which therefore means that only through discipline can you actually achieve a long-term success, right? Persistence and discipline are what drive you to actually create free will, because if if the human being freely wills to be healthy, to be loved, appreciated, to be well taken care of, then they, if they're not disciplined, they won't be able to achieve that. In a sense, maybe some potentials, they might reach a certain happiness level within a particular area, but it's not going to be through every single aspect.
Right. And you can and yeah, like maybe the way they perceive things can affect their happiness, you know? And they can choose to perceive discipline as a negative thing or as a rewarding thing. And that's an example of how our thoughts can control everything else, you know? Because when I use the word perceive, I'm meaning like the way you think about something can change the
Yeah,
way the outcome. Definitely.
yeah,
So
yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, talking about free will in our thoughts. I mean, we can't really say free will unless we're truly disciplining ourselves every day to freely will the good of ourselves and the good of others, right? So
yeah, if we want to use free will for good,
if we want to use free will for good, for the actual benefit of ourselves, because we can freely choose not to make decisions that are good, because we don't have the discipline built or the
right?
persistence built to create a lifestyle that is, or at least we don't know, right? Our family, our upbringing doesn't teach us how to freely will the good of ourselves and of others. And so therefore we make decisions which affect our thoughts, right? Which create experiences and in situations that are stored in our memory, which create certain thoughts and ideas of the world, which become the hardware of how we function, or the software of how we function, our programming of how we see the world.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
it's almost like it's through our actions. Do you think it's our actions that affect our thoughts, or what's the chicken and the egg, or the egg
Yeah, it's definitely a
and
chicken.
the chicken?
It is a chicken or egg because yes, our thoughts, our behaviors can can change our thoughts, and yet our thoughts can also change and affect our behaviors. If someone, I'm trying to think of an example, like if someone has social anxiety and they choose to avoid social situations, their social anxiety is going to become worse, and they're not going to overcome their fear of social anxiety or the situation. So if they change their behavior to instead face the social situation that they fear, then their social anxiety will decrease, and so will their social anxiety thoughts. So that means if they change their behavior by facing the fear, which change their thoughts, which change their anxiety level. So that's an example of how behavior can change a thought. And so a thought can also change a behavior, right? If someone is struggling with a substance use. So like if they have memories of using the substance and then are they reminded of it, then they have thoughts that they want to use again. Because it's not like they just go and use the substance. It starts with thoughts, cravings, and feelings. And the thoughts are what drive them to use the substance again. And it's when they change those thoughts that then they can change the behavior of using the substance or not with something called a relapse prevention plan. So yes, like those are like examples, right, of thoughts controlling behaviors and behaviors controlling thoughts. So it's kind of really weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a both and.
Really strange. Same with
Mm,
emotions and thoughts.
yeah. Well, any last thoughts, Steele?
Um, hopefully this tells the audience that you have hope because you can start taking control of your thoughts. It may feel impossible at times, but there are techniques and ways to do it, and they are physical things.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Thank you for listening into our podcast today. We hope that you really found this valuable, and we hope that you decide to subscribe to our channel. We do have many different videos coming up. We're also starting different branches of content, so we look forward to providing more content for you guys. And until next time, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.